we talk about policies and procedures, and I did a session earlier on around SharePoint Premium, and even there, policies and procedures, well, not policies and procedures, but policies are high up on, adding that extra layer of security to something as rudimentary as SharePoint, right? And Microsoft has done a lot. But I mean, what are the things, the first thing, Nick, that always comes to my mind, if the slide moves, and this slide has been around for as long as I can remember the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture. It's still my favorite slide, right? And Microsoft used to have these security defaults things in Azure. They flipped it around. It became mandatory, and then global admins, they forced MFA on that. But from a conditional access, and you like this sort of policy evaluation engine that conditional access gives you, right? Yes, it's with an Azure. Still call it Azure AD. Entra ID Plan 1. You get conditional access, right? Should we say that you only have to buy one license, or don't we talk about that?
This is not a licensing session, but what I really do love about the slide, Al, is that it gives us a very fungible or tangible example of really what is a zero trust policy. And a zero trust policy is nothing but a decision tree or a rules engine that you're putting something through. In this case, it's identity, and identity for either a human being or identity for a device. So with that in mind, what we've got here is effectively the essence of zero trust that's expressed through a technological medium, which is conditional access. And it says who can do what at what time and under what circumstances. And of course, that also applies forward to resource. So Al, we love these slides because it really does show that a user coming in from a certain device, when they have met the rule engine, can do what we allow them to do.
And, walking through, we talk about conditional access, and we talk about conditional access policies, and, the blade in Entra gets hellishly confusing because it says included, excluded, and then you've got these cool things called conditional access app control policies that talks to Defender for cloud apps. But a traditional example of what a conditional access policy really walks through, right? Got a user, Nick always talks about the identity, and then just below that, in Nick's favorite slide, you've got the device, right? And then you've got some sort of resource sitting in the cloud. And what conditional access actually does is, this is a simple example. Sales account representative, is in the London users group from a Windows device. And the first signal, because it's all about signals, signal detection, enforce, right? Those are my three tenets. You've got different three tenets to the zero trust approach. But when we look at actually what happens, right, how this continuous risk evaluation engine runs, and this, people, is just conditional access. So if there's one thing you do tomorrow, right, or even now, don't jump off the call, but if you did have to leave now, right, go fix your conditional access, or at least go configure some policies in report mode, right, so that you can actually do this. The other thing, when you configure a conditional access policy, please don't lock yourself out of the tenant, because we've seen that movie. So when we look at what this actually does, in this case, it went through some sort of risk profiling, high risk, blocked access, and forced some sort of threat remediation. Nick, what would that sort of threat remediation be? Examples?
Well, let's assume I have a relatively low risk. I trust my users, but I don't trust their devices. That could mean that I give them read-only access to my data. So, for example, you can open your portal and see the data, but you may not download anything. Or if you've a high risk for anything, maybe we lock out your account and force you to MFA, or if you're super high risk user, so you're an executive, we lock you out and then require a help desk user to prove that you're an actual human being.
And so understand what the evaluation does. You could literally force a password reset, re-enable MFA for that if it's a high risk. So you do have various mechanisms. You don't have to just block everything and, you know, delete the account because you're scared. There are varying levels of severity that you can do. Some other things to consider, and this is also license dependent. Nick, you've been talking about PIM-PAM for some time. You know, I mean, we looked at, what is it, lifecycle workflows for identities and all of those things. PIM-PAM, TIM-TAM, it always confused me.
So TIM-TAM is a lovely chocolate, which has got absolutely nothing to do with a competing identity product. But PIM-PAM, in a nutshell, allows us to make sure that we have got a foundational tenant in Zero Trust for identities, which is no standing access for administrators. And that means that administrators become administrators at the correct level of privilege for a finite amount of time. And that workflow is authenticated by a user in the business who okays the request for that type of access. So Al, the administrator, is not an administrator. And if his password is compromised or his identity gets taken over, they get nothing. Because when Al needs to be an administrator, Al will be that administrator for an hour or a day and only administrate that thing or that system or that service for as long as he needs to. And then is automatically demoted.
Yeah, I used to see TIM-TAM's actually an LDAP product. And highly regulated industry, if anyone on the call has ever used NIST as the framework, you know, or the standard, this is one of those things. You must enable privileged access and privileged identity management in whatever environment. And there was always third-party tools that used to sort of elevate your privileges, right? Why? Because when you think about Nick's tenets of Zero Trust, least privilege is right there. And Microsoft does subscribe to least privilege, right? I was doing something in Azure, and I'm a global admin, but then I was also a user admin because I needed to do user tasks for, I can't remember the reason. I was unable to do global admin tasks in the tenant because least privilege on that specific subscription. But Nick, you've been working with Microsoft recently, and it's not only around privileged identity management, but there's also a host of other tools that Microsoft is recommending you start looking at. And you were talking about CSA and those other three-letter acronyms. These are some of the things that they were talking about.
So what we're looking at here, and for those of us who know this by another name or another product, this is effectively Microsoft's version 1 or version 0.9 of what Zscaler has become famous for, which is the Security Service Edge. And what Microsoft has done is using the identity engine and their conditional access rules engine has allowed us to define what users are able to do on the internet and also what users are unable to do on the internet, as well as what can users do to internal resources in our data center. Now that, from a Zero Trust point of view, has been sadly the forgotten stepchild of Microsoft's security strategy for the last 5 or 10 years, because Microsoft has done very little for us in the data center. But what this does mean in terms of actual manifestation is that we can now do something as radical as require multi-factor authentication for LDAP or RDP on resources on our own internal network. So there's a lot more to unpack here, but effectively the point that we want to make is that we are now able to consume our Microsoft identity and safeguard resources that are either outside, so cloud-based resources, think Salesforce or the other white meat if you are into any other flavors of cloud, and internal resources that you've always had but have been unable to secure.
The other white meat. So we've talked about the types of policies and roles. We haven't even talked about RBAC. You know, role-based access control, and Nick is going to do a demo to show you how crazy it is when it comes to permissions. But it's all great and well that we create these policies. We look at all the cool sort of CASB on steroids, things that Microsoft's doing. But, you know, you've got to have a a pragmatic approach when you start looking at identity posture and identity maturity modeling from a governance perspective. And there's a nice framework that the M365 people use, and it's similar. You need to understand where you are from a posture perspective, and you can literally work on the various levels inside of your organization. So these are simple words to use for you to measure. Now, part of looking at AppGov, and Nick will show you some other things around identity gov in the tool, but you really need to figure out where you are on the maturity scale when it comes to identity governance, because that will allow you to understand what you need to do next. So something like, do you have conditional access policies in your environment that are documented and planned and controlled and stable? That would put you at a level 300. Outside of the other cool, PIM PAM, those sorts of things, something like you shouldn't have global administrators and you need to elevate privileges through privileged access and privileged identity management. Those other tools, the identity governance stuff, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But understand that from a maturity modeling, you can't just rush and close all the doors all the time, right? Understand that you need to plan this. Make sense? I see everyone nodding accordingly. Moving on from
nodding.
Yeah, moving on from the policies, from the roles, the functional components of this, you also need to understand,